When 19-year-old Elvis Presley walked into that tiny recording studio in Memphis, he had no idea that in just 4 minutes, his entire world was about to come crashing down. He had saved up $11 whole from his job driving a truck, money his poor family really needed for rent. But he spent it anyway, because he had this big dream of recording a song for his mama. His hands were shaking as he stood in front of that cold microphone, and his voice cracked with nervousness as he tried to sing a ballad called My Happiness. But then, something happened that would haunt him for months. The famous producer Sam Phillips held up his hand and said one single word that felt like a punch to the gut. Enough. Just like that, after only 4 minutes, it was over. Elvis felt his dreams crumble right there in that stuffy little studio. He wanted to run out the door and never come back. He thought he had failed completely, that Sam had heard his voice and decided he just was not good enough. What Elvis did not know in that terrible moment was that Sam Phillips had actually heard something else entirely, something that would change music history forever. But it would take months of pain and doubt before Elvis would understand what really happened in those 4 minutes. Stay with me, because what happens next is absolutely incredible, and the truth about why Sam said enough will shock you. This is the story of how one devastating word actually saved Elvis Presley's career. But you have to watch until the very end to find out how everything shifted and why that terrible day turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to him. The afternoon sun blazed through the dusty windows of the Memphis recording service on Union Avenue, casting long shadows across the cramped studio where a 19-year-old truck driver stood trembling before a microphone that seemed to judge him with its cold, metallic indifference. Elvis Presley had saved $11 from his meager wages, money that should have gone toward helping his parents pay rent in the Lauderdale Courts housing project. But instead, he clutched it in his sweaty palm as he prepared to record a song for his mother. The year was 1954, and nothing in his life had prepared him for what Sam Phillips would say after just 4 minutes of listening to his voice crack and waver through My Happiness, a Ink Spots ballad that his mama loved. Sam stopped the recording, held up one weathered hand, and said the word that would echo in Elvis's mind for weeks afterward: enough. The studio fell silent, except for the hum of equipment, and Elvis felt something inside him collapse like a building imploding from its foundation, each floor of hope and dreams crashing down onto the one below until nothing remained but rubble and dust. Marion Kiesker, Sam's assistant, who had been the one to actually record Elvis that day while Sam was out, watched the young man's face transform from nervous excitement to something resembling death itself, and she felt a maternal instinct rise up in her chest that she could not explain. She had heard thousands of aspiring singers walk through that door, each one convinced they possessed something special, something that would separate them from the endless parade of mediocrity that marched through Memphis every single day. Most of them were delusional, their talent as thin as the paper their dreams were written on. But something about this peculiar boy, with the long sideburns and the second-hand clothes, had caught her attention in a way she could not articulate even to herself. When Sam said, enough, she saw Elvis's shoulders slump forward, as though an invisible weight had been placed upon them. Saw his fingers release the death grip he had maintained on the headphones. Saw his eyes dart toward the exit, as though calculating how quickly he could escape this humiliation. But Marion remembered something else about that day, something that would prove more significant than anyone could have imagined. Something that connected to a moment still to come, that would change not just Elvis's life, but the entire landscape of American music. Elvis left the studio that afternoon, believing he had failed spectacularly, that Sam Phillips had heard his voice and found it wanting, that his secret dream of becoming a singer was as foolish as his high school classmates had always told him it was. He climbed into his truck, a battered vehicle that coughed and sputtered like a dying animal, and drove through the streets of Memphis with tears he refused to let fall burning behind his eyes. His parents, Vernon and Gladys, were waiting for him in their cramped apartment, and he knew his mother would ask him how the recording went, would search his face for signs of success or disappointment, would try to comfort him with words about God's plan and better days ahead. But Elvis could not bear to see the worry in her eyes, the worry that never seemed to leave her face, no matter how hard he worked, or how many hours he spent trying to make enough money to lift them out of poverty. Instead of going home, he drove to the Mississippi River and sat on the bank watching the water flow past, thick and brown and eternal, carrying everything that fell into it away towards some distant ocean he had never seen. The weeks that followed were a special kind of torture for Elvis, the kind that comes from having touched something precious only to have it yanked away before you could truly grasp it. He returned to driving the truck for Crown Electric Company, delivering supplies and making small talk with customers who saw him as nothing more than a polite young man with strange hair and a peculiar way of dressing. His co-workers at Crown Electric were decent men, hard-working and honest, but they looked at Elvis with a mixture of amusement and pity, as though they recognized something in him that he had not yet recognized in himself, some fundamental unsuitability for the ordinary life that awaited him. At night, he would lie in bed in the room he shared with his parents, their apartment so small that privacy was a luxury none of them could afford, and he would replay that moment in the studio over and over again, wondering what he had done wrong. What had prompted Sam Phillips to stop him after just 4 minutes and say that single devastating word? But Marian Kieska had not forgotten about Elvis Presley, and she carried the memory of his voice like a secret treasure she was waiting for the right moment to reveal. She had made a note in Sam's files, scribbling down words that would seem prophetic later: good ballad singer, and hold for future reference. Sam trusted Marian's instincts, had learned over the years that she possessed an almost supernatural ability to identify raw talent hiding beneath layers of inexperience and nerves, but even she could not have predicted what would happen when the right song finally found its way to the right singer at exactly the right moment in history. The song was called Without You, and it had been written by a man who wanted a vocalist with a different kind of sound, something that blended the emotional depth of blues with the accessibility of pop. Something that did not yet have a name, but would soon be called rock and roll. Several months after that devastating afternoon, when Sam had said, "Enough," Marian called Elvis at his home and asked him to come back to the studio for another session. Elvis almost refused, almost told her that he had accepted his limitations and moved on with his life, almost pretended that music no longer mattered to him the way it once had. But something in Marian's voice, some quality of certainty that transcended ordinary encouragement, made him agree to return. He told his mother about the call, and Gladys grabbed his face in her hands and kissed his forehead, and told him she had been praying for this moment, had been asking God to give her boy another chance to show the world what she already knew he could do. Vernon was more skeptical, worried that another disappointment would break something in his son that could not be repaired. But he kept his concerns to himself and simply told Elvis to do his best. The night Elvis returned to Memphis recording service, Sam Phillips was there along with 2 musicians he had recruited for the session: Scotty Moore on guitar and Bill Black on bass. The 3 of them looked at Elvis with expressions that ranged from curious to doubtful, and Elvis felt the familiar terror rising in his throat, threatening to choke off his voice before he could even begin. They spent hours working through various songs, trying to find something that clicked, something that felt right. But everything sounded wrong and forced and artificial. Sam grew increasingly frustrated, his patience wearing thin as the clock ticked past midnight and then into the early hours of morning. Elvis could feel failure approaching again, could sense that he was about to disappoint everyone in that room and confirm their growing suspicion that Marian had been wrong about him, that he was just another mediocre singer with an ordinary voice and no particular distinction. Then something happened that no one could have planned or predicted, something that emerged from desperation and exhaustion and the strange alchemy that sometimes occurs when talented people stop trying to be perfect and simply allow themselves to be authentic. During a break, while Sam was in the control room and Scotty and Bill were relaxing with cigarettes, Elvis started fooling around with an old blues song by Arthur Crudup called That's All Right. He was not trying to impress anyone or prove anything, was simply letting himself feel the music and respond to it in whatever way felt natural. His voice took on a quality it had not possessed during the formal recording attempts, something loose and free and utterly original, and his body began moving in ways that would later become iconic, but in that moment was simply an extension of how the music made him feel. Scotty heard what Elvis was doing and picked up his guitar, adding a driving rhythm that pushed the song forward with irresistible momentum. Bill grabbed his bass and started slapping it with a technique that created a percussive sound unlike anything anyone had heard in popular music before. Sam Phillips heard what was happening from the control room and came rushing back into the studio with an expression on his face that was part shock and part recognition, as though he had been waiting his entire career for this exact sound and had finally found it in the most unlikely place imaginable. He told them to do it again, to capture what they had just created, and they ran through "That's All Right" with the tape rolling, lightning striking twice in the same impossible place. When they finished, Sam played back the recording, and everyone in that room knew they had stumbled onto something that transcended conventional categories, something that combined elements of blues and country and gospel in a way that had never been done before. Elvis sounded nothing like the nervous ballad singer who had recorded My Happiness months earlier, nothing like the tentative performer who had been struggling all night to please Sam Phillips. He sounded like himself, raw and real and dangerous in the best possible way. What happened next would become the stuff of legend, how Sam took the recording to Dewey Phillips, a popular disc jockey at WHBQ who hosted a show called Red Hot and Blue, and how Dewey played That's All Right on the air and received such an overwhelming response that he played it 14 times in a row while trying to track down Elvis to bring him to the studio for an interview. Elvis was hiding at the Suzerain No. 2 movie theater, too terrified to listen to the radio and hear what people thought of his recording. But his parents heard it and started crying with joy, and neighbors began knocking on their door to congratulate them. And by the time Dewey finally got Elvis on the air, the phone lines at the radio station had been overwhelmed with listeners demanding to know where they could buy the record. Dewey asked Elvis what high school he had attended, a subtle way of letting the audience know that this remarkable new voice belonged to a white singer performing music that had previously been the exclusive domain of black artists, and the racial implications of that fact would reverberate through American culture in ways both profound and troubling for decades to come. But success did not arrive as a smooth, upward trajectory. And the months following that breakthrough recording were filled with struggles and setbacks that would have broken someone with less determination or a different kind of hunger. Elvis performed at small venues and county fairs, faced audiences who did not know what to make of him, endured criticism from people who found his music too wild and his stage presence too sexual, and his entire existence too threatening to the established order. There were nights when only a handful of people showed up to watch him perform, nights when he wondered if his brief moment of fame had already passed, nights when the poverty that had defined his entire life seemed ready to reclaim him permanently. His parents continued to struggle financially, continued to worry about paying rent and buying food, continued to live with the uncertainty that had always characterized their existence as poor Southerners trying to survive in a society that offered them few opportunities. Then there was Prescott Crawford, a talent manager from Nashville who had heard about Elvis through industry connections and saw in him not just a talented singer, but a potential goldmine, someone who could appeal to both white and black audiences and bridge the racial divide that defined American popular music. Prescott was a complex figure, motivated by both genuine appreciation for Elvis's talent and the cold calculus of commercial success. Someone who understood that music was ultimately a business, and that even the most authentic art had to be packaged and sold to consumers who had limited attention spans and unpredictable tastes. He approached Elvis with promises of stardom and wealth, told him that with the right management and promotion, he could become the biggest singer in America, bigger than Frank Sinatra or Perry Como or any of the established stars who dominated the charts. Elvis wanted to believe Prescott, wanted to trust that success was possible, but he had learned from painful experience that hope was a dangerous thing, something that could lift you up only to drop you from an even greater height. The deal Prescott offered Elvis seemed generous at first glance, a contract that would give him representation and access to recording studios and promotional machinery that he could never afford on his own. But there were clauses buried in the legal language that troubled Elvis when he tried to read them. Provisions that gave Prescott control over his career in ways that made him uncomfortable. Terms that would bind him for years to decisions he had no authority to change. He brought the contract home to show Vernon and Gladys, and his parents studied it with the wariness of people who had been cheated and exploited throughout their lives. People who knew that anyone offering something too good to be true was usually running some kind of con. Vernon wanted Elvis to refuse the deal, to maintain his independence and not sign away his future to a man they barely knew. But Gladys saw the desperation in her son's eyes, the need to escape the poverty that had suffocated their family for generations. And she told Vernon that sometimes you had to take risks if you wanted your circumstances to change. Elvis signed the contract with Prescott Crawford on a humid afternoon in July 1955, using a pen that kept skipping on the cheap paper, his signature looking shaky and uncertain, like a declaration written by someone who was not entirely convinced of what they were doing. Prescott shook his hand with the confident grip of a man who had just acquired something valuable, and he told Elvis that his life was about to change in ways he could not yet imagine. In the months that followed, Prescott proved both right and wrong in his predictions, right about Elvis's potential to become a massive star, but wrong about the nature of fame and what it would cost the young man who had simply wanted to sing for his mother. The performances increased, moving from small clubs to larger venues, from local events to regional tours, from obscurity to a kind of recognition that felt both thrilling and terrifying. Elvis's name began appearing in newspapers and music magazines, described with adjectives like revolutionary and shocking and controversial, and older people began complaining about his influence on teenagers, while those same teenagers began imitating his hairstyle and his clothes and his way of moving. But fame brought complications that Elvis had never anticipated, pressures and expectations and invasions of privacy that made him long for the simplicity of driving a truck and living anonymously in Memphis. Journalists wrote articles that distorted his words and invented controversies where none existed. Critics attacked him for corrupting youth and destroying traditional values. Religious leaders denounced him from pulpits as an agent of moral decay. His relationship with his parents began to strain under the weight of his success, not because they did not love him, but because the distance between his new life and their old one was growing too vast to bridge with simple affection. Vernon struggled with feeling useless and emasculated by his son's wealth, unable to contribute in meaningful ways to the family finances, relegated to the role of dependent rather than provider. Gladys worried constantly about Elvis's health and safety, convinced that fame would ultimately destroy him, that the world would take her beautiful boy and consume him until nothing remained but a hollow shell. There were women too, endless women who threw themselves at Elvis with an aggression that both excited and disturbed him. Women who wanted to possess him, or be possessed by him, or simply add him to their collection of conquests. He tried to maintain relationships, but found himself incapable of the vulnerability that intimacy required, too guarded and too damaged by sudden fame to let anyone truly know him. He dated actresses and singers, and regular girls from small towns, but none of them could reach the part of him that remained locked away, the part that remembered being poor and mocked and told enough after just 4 minutes. The loneliness of fame became its own kind of prison, more comfortable than poverty, but no less confining, surrounding him with people who wanted things from him, but could not offer what he truly needed. Prescott Crawford pushed Elvis to record music that was more commercial and less authentic. Songs that appealed to the broadest possible audience, but sacrificed the raw quality that had made "That's All Right" so revolutionary. They argued constantly about artistic direction, with Prescott insisting that mainstream success required compromise, and Elvis insisting that he had to remain true to the music that had saved him from obscurity. Some of the recordings from this period were brilliant, capturing lightning in a bottle the way Sam Phillips had that night at Memphis Recording Service, but others felt hollow and manufactured, designed to sell records rather than express anything genuine. Elvis could hear the difference, even when audiences could not, could feel himself drifting away from the hungry truck driver who had saved $11 to record a song for his mother, becoming instead a product being packaged and sold to consumers who did not really know him at all. Then came the night in Tupelo, Mississippi, where Elvis had been born in a 2-room shotgun house that his parents had lost during his childhood, returning as a star to perform before thousands of people who had once ignored or dismissed him. The concert was held at the Mississippi-Alabama Fair and Dairy Show, the same event where young Elvis had won second place in a talent contest years earlier, singing Old Shep while other kids laughed at his performance. Now he stood on a much bigger stage, wearing clothes that cost more than his father had earned in months of work, preparing to perform for an audience that had paid money to see him. He looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar from his childhood, and some belonging to strangers. And he felt a disconnection from reality so profound that he wondered if he was dreaming, or hallucinating, or losing his mind. His mother and father sat in the front row, Gladys crying openly, and Vernon trying to maintain composure, and Elvis wanted nothing more than to step off that stage and return to being their son, instead of being Elvis Presley the phenomenon. During the performance, something happened that Elvis would never discuss publicly, but that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Something connected to that moment when Sam Phillips had said enough, and everything had seemed lost. He was singing "That's All Right," the song that had changed his trajectory, when he saw a man standing at the edge of the crowd who looked exactly like Sam Phillips, but could not possibly be Sam, because Sam was back in Memphis running his studio. The man was watching Elvis with an expression of profound sadness, as though witnessing something beautiful being destroyed in real time. And Elvis felt his voice falter mid-phrase the way it had faltered during that first recording session. He recovered quickly, professional instincts taking over, but for the remainder of the concert, he kept searching the crowd for that face and could not find it again. After the show, he asked several people if they had seen anyone matching that description, but no one knew what he was talking about, and he began to wonder if exhaustion and stress had caused him to hallucinate. Back in his hotel room that night, alone despite being surrounded by people who worked for him or wanted things from him, Elvis picked up the phone and called Marion Kiesker at her home in Memphis. She answered with a voice thick with sleep, confused about why he was calling at 2 a.m, but she listened as he told her about seeing the man who looked like Sam, and about the strange feeling of displacement he had experienced on stage. Marion was quiet for a long time before she spoke, and when she finally did, her words carried a weight that suggested she had been waiting to tell him something important. She said that Sam Phillips had nearly given up on finding the sound he was looking for before Elvis walked into that studio, had been on the verge of closing Memphis recording service and moving to Nashville to work as a session engineer, had been convinced that the kind of music he dreamed of creating did not actually exist. When Sam had said enough after those first 4 minutes, he had not been rejecting Elvis, but rather stopping him from wasting time on material that did not showcase his real talent, protecting him from recording something mediocre that would have defined him as just another ordinary singer. Marion told Elvis that Sam had heard something in those 4 minutes that made him want to find the right vehicle for Elvis's voice, something that suggested potential beyond what the nervous 19-year-old truck driver had been attempting with My Happiness. The months between that first session and the night they recorded That's All Right had been intentional on Sam's part. A period of waiting for the right song and the right circumstances and the right moment when everything would align. When Marion had called Elvis to come back to the studio, it had been at Sam's specific request, because Sam believed that Elvis was ready for something more challenging and more authentic than sentimental ballads. The breakthrough that night had not been accidental, but rather the culmination of careful planning by someone who understood that true talent needed time and space to develop, that rushing the process would have produced something forgettable instead of something revolutionary. Elvis felt something shift inside him as he listened to Marion explain what had really happened, felt the bitter seed of rejection that had been growing in his heart since that afternoon when Sam said, "Enough," begin to dissolve and transform into something else entirely. He had spent months believing that he had failed during those first 4 minutes, that Sam had found him lacking, and only given him another chance out of pity or obligation. But now he understood that Sam had been protecting him, steering him away from a path that would have led nowhere, waiting for him to be ready for the opportunity that would define his career. The man he had seen at the Tupelo concert had not been Sam Phillips at all, but rather some projection of his own guilt and confusion, his subconscious mind creating a vision that would force him to confront questions he had been avoiding about authenticity and compromise and the price of success. In the years that followed, Elvis Presley would become the biggest star in the world, selling hundreds of millions of records and appearing in dozens of films and performing to audiences that numbered in the tens of thousands. But he would also struggle with addiction and depression and a sense of isolation that fame only intensified, would see his marriage fall apart and his health deteriorate, and his artistic ambitions gradually surrender to commercial pressures. He would lose his mother to illness when she was only 46 years old, and that loss would create a wound that never healed, a grief that manifested in destructive behaviors and self-medication and relationships that repeated the same patterns of need and abandonment. He would be drafted into the army and serve his time like any other young man, would try to prove that he was not just an entertainer, but a citizen willing to sacrifice for his country. But even that experience would be transformed into publicity opportunities that made him feel like a fraud. Through all of it, through the triumphs and disasters and everything in between, Elvis would remember that afternoon when Sam Phillips said "enough" after just 4 minutes, would remember how that single word had felt like the end of everything he hoped for, would remember the terror and shame of believing he had been found wanting and dismissed. And he would remember what Marion Keisker had told him that night in the hotel room, about how Sam had actually been protecting him and preparing him and waiting for him to be ready for something greater than he could have imagined. The word "enough" had not been a rejection, but rather a redirection, not an ending, but a pause before a beginning, not a judgment, but an invitation to become something more than he had been capable of being in that moment. The truth about what shifted after those 4 minutes was not that Elvis suddenly became talented, or that Sam Phillips recognized genius where none had existed before, but rather that sometimes the people who challenge us and redirect us and refuse to let us settle for mediocrity are the ones who believe in us most deeply, who see possibilities we cannot yet see in ourselves, who understand that greatness requires more than raw talent and good intentions. Sam Phillips had heard something in Elvis's voice that day, something worth cultivating and developing and waiting for. And his willingness to say enough, when others might have simply praised and encouraged, had created space for the real Elvis Presley to emerge. The shift was not magical or instantaneous, but rather the result of patience and vision, and a refusal to accept anything less than authentic expression. And it changed not just one young man's life, but the entire trajectory of popular music for generations to come.